Today we're going to be reviewing and comparing every single Akko Switch. And if at any point during the video you want to check out any of the Akko Switches, you can click right over there in the left corner, but let's jump into it. Okay, so first we're breaking it into two categories. One is linear and the secondary tactile. There are 8 linears we're going to review and compare each one to each other, and then we're going to do a stock and lube sound test, and then after the linear section, we're going to do a full sound test back-to-back stock and back-to-back lubed. Let's jump into it. And starting with the Jelly Black. This thing is 50 grams, so on the heavier side of all of the Akko Switches, 1.9 millimeters of pre-travel, and that is what they look like. Now these come in at $12 for a 45 pack, and these are a fantastic switch for thock. Like all the other jelly versions, these have a dust-proof stem, creating even less stem wobble than the non-jelly Akko Switches. However, I will not be talking about stem wobble anymore because the non-jellies have very little and the jellies have even less, as you can see right here. So it's not gonna be a deal breaker for any of the switches in my opinion. So let's move on. Now the springs on the Jelly Blacks are quite long at 22 millimeters. Now longer springs compared to shorter springs will start off lighter and will gradually become heavier, while shorter springs will quickly become heavy. The difference here is that the longer spring will make it easier to actuate the switch, but will still allow for a fairly heavy bottom out. I absolutely love this. Now, like all the other jelly switches, this uses a top and bottom housing made of polycarbonate and a stem made of palm. Now, as far as smoothness, these are damn smooth stock. You can absolutely use these without lubing. However, after lubing, they really shine. And if you're going for thockiness, this is definitely the thockiest Akko Switch for sure. And I will say, these are thockier than Gateron Black Ink V2s. I have tested them with it. Kind of blew me away. That being said, I did notice almost all of the switches come with a pre-lubed leaf. Like literally only the leaf is lubed. So that's kind of interesting. But take a listen to the stock and the lube sound test. Moving on to the Akko Silver switches, these things are a little bit lighter at only 43 grams with a 3 millimeter total travel distance and only 1 millimeter of pre-travel, so great for gamers. Now these are also great for a thocky board. If you haven't noticed, we're going from thockiest to clackiest, and yes, I know, the board is mainly what is going to change the thock or the clack or the pop. So do keep in mind if you have a poppy board and put a thocky switch on there, it's still probably gonna be poppy. However, we are going from thockiest to clackiest to poppiest, just dependent on the switch. This is the most expensive switch on the list at $14 for a 45 pack. Now this also, like the Jelly Black, has a longer 22 millimeter spring. Pair this with considerably shorter travel distance of only 3 millimeters, and this makes for a very nice feeling switch, especially for gamers. However, even just for typing, it is quite nice. This is also the second deepest and thockiest switch on the list, which is saying something because it does have that shorter travel distance, which is interesting. So if you're a gamer and you want a nice thocky switch for gaming, this is a very good one. The Jelly Blacks, however, will be better for typists who like a linear switch. The top housing is polycarbonate, the bottom housing is nylon, and the stem is palm. Smoothness, unlubed, is quite good, but not quite as good as the Jelly Blacks. Take a listen to the stock, then lube sound test. Moving on to the Radiant Reds, these things are 53 grams, so heavier. However, they have a total travel distance of 3.5 millimeters, so more than the silver switches, but less than the Jelly Blacks. Now this gives it an interesting bottom out, and I really do like it. And this has 1.9 millimeters of pre-travel, pretty typical. These are also a thocky switch, but slightly lesser than the previous two. However, if you're going for a deeper thocky build, these are still quite good, and they are the cheapest compared to the previous two at only $10 for a 45 pack. Insanely affordable. Now this is not part of the jelly family, so it does not have the dust-proof stem, which adds a slight amount more stem wobble, and I mean very slight. This should not affect your buying decision at all. Now the spring gets shorter on this one at 18 millimeters, but this is still considered a longer spring. That being said, compared to the Jelly Blacks and Silvers, immediately there is more resistance due to the shorter spring. That longer spring builds slower, while this one is slightly faster to go heavy. That being said, for being insanely budget friendly, if you're on a tight budget, this is a great way for some super budget thock. The top housing is a polycarbonate, the bottom housing is nylon, and the stem is palm. As far as smoothness, unlubed, these are smooth, but noticeably less smooth than the Jelly Blacks and Silvers. However, after lubing, they feel very similar in terms of smoothness. Like most Akko switches, they really come to life when lubed. Take a listen to the sound test before and after lubing. And moving on to the Matcha greens, these things are 50 grams with 4 millimeters of total travel distance and a pre-travel distance of 1.9 millimeters. These are an OG Switch. Now these are still very thocky and share a very similar feel to the Radiant Reds, but slightly lighter and have a larger travel distance. Now which one you should buy gets harder here, as this is the same price as the Radiant Reds at $10 for a 45 pack. The Switch is a more typical length here at 15 millimeters, so the weight does come on faster. However, this is a progressive spring, so the bottom out is noticeably softer. Now, which one I prefer? I like the feelings of the Matcha greens more. However, the sound of the Radiant Reds is incredibly similar, but just a little bit deeper. The Matcha greens share the same overall materials for build, and they also feel the same as far as smoothness, both lubed and unlubed compared to the Radiant Reds. Take a listen to the sound test before and after. Now moving on to the jelly whites, these actually took me by surprise. However, these are 35 grams, so very light, with a 4 millimeter total travel distance and 1.9 millimeters of pre-travel. I thought these were going to be very similar to the vintage whites. However, they turned out to be quite different, even though they have a very similar weight and actuation and total travel distance. They're quite different. And also, like all the other jellies, these are $12 for a 45 pack. Now the spring is, again, like the other jellies, a 22 millimeter spring. This long spring and lightweight makes for a very nice switch. The bottom out is nice and soft, and they create almost a muted bottom out sound. It's nice and it's kind of clacky when lubed. It's kind of muted. I like it. It's interesting. The material is the same as other jelly switches, and they are incredibly smooth unlubed. Take a listen to the sound test, lubed and unlubed. But moving right on to the jelly pinks, these things are 45 grams, a total travel distance of 4 millimeters, and 1.9 millimeters of pre-travel. These things are awesome, not because of all those stats, but because they are so freaking smooth. That's the big thing with this switch. Now this is where we leave thock land and really enter clack territory. I wouldn't consider the last switch a thocky switch, but it kind of borders between muted, clacky, and clacky. So this is where we really enter clacky land. These have a nice deeper clack sound to them, which does sound pretty good in my opinion. As these are jelly switches like the blacks, they are slightly more expensive at $12 for a 45 pack. Now the spring on these is again a super long 22 millimeter spring, which I think is matched quite well for this switch. Now, like I said, this is a deeper clack, definitely not thocky, but not super crazy clacky either. I think as far as sound, this is a great middle ground that sounds nice, but isn't crazy for people that don't know their preferred sound yet. The materials are shared amongst all jelly switches, so this is the same as the jelly blacks. However, this is the smoothest switch on the list. Like, damn, is this thing smooth? Unlubed, these feel absolutely insane. After lubing, they feel fantastic. However, if you don't really want to lube your switch, I highly recommend it. But if you really don't want to, this is 100% the best switch on the list for smoothness. Seriously good. Take a listen to the sound test before and after lubing. Moving on to the Rose Reds. This is a very unique switch. Now this comes in at 43 grams, 3.5 millimeters of total travel distance with a pre-travel of 1.9 millimeters. And yes, these have a special place in my heart because of that very beautiful poppy sound. I'm more of a thocky guy, but I appreciate some nice poppiness and absolutely some clacks. And oh my God, is this a beautiful pop. Hands down, if you want a poppy keyboard, this is the switch for a beautiful poppy sound, not overbearing poppy, but just beautiful. For the price of $10 for a 45 pack, you get a whole lot of sexy clack. The spring on this is a progressive 15 millimeter spring, and for this weight, it feels really good. Definitely a switch I could use every day. Now unlubed, they sound poppy, but after lubing, it makes them beautifully clacky. If you get these, you absolutely 100% should lube them. The materials here are shared with the Matcha greens, and as far as smoothness, they feel the same as the Matcha greens, which is to be expected. Take a listen to the sound test before and after lubed. And moving on to probably the most unique switch, the vintage white. Coming in at 35 grams with a 4 millimeter total travel distance and a pre-travel of 1.9 millimeters. That's not really what's different with the switch. What's different is the sound profile. This thing is poppy as hell. Now, by far, this is the poppiest switch on the list. It doesn't matter if you have a thocky ass board, a clacky board, if you lube these and put them in there, this will be poppy as hell. These are $10 for a 45 pack. They use a 22 millimeter spring similar to the jelly switches, but it's not quite as smooth as the jellies unlubed, which would be expected. After lubing though, it is still very smooth, especially for the price. Now the materials are the same here as the Matcha greens, the Rose Reds, and such like that. But yeah, if you want a poppy ass switch, This is just nuts. Take a listen to the sound test. All right, now before we move into the tactiles, here is the back-to-back sound test, stock of all of them, and then lubed. Take a listen. And that is how they sound. Let's move right into tactiles. The Akko Ocean Blues. This is an OG switch, the first tactile that they made. Now this is 36 grams with 46 grams of tactile force. 1.9 millimeters of pre-travel with the tactility starting at 0.5 millimeters. And that is important because of what we're gonna compare this to. But yeah, a great tactile switch. Let's go into it. Now of all the tactile switches, these have the highest pitch sound. It's not super high pitched to begin with, but definitely compared to the other tactiles, it is the highest of them, but it's still not very high. Now these are $10 for a pack of 45, which is very reasonable. This uses a 15 millimeter progressive spring, which is good, but not perfect for this switch. Now unlubed, they are pretty smooth, but after lubing, this is where they really come to life. If you get these, absolutely lube them. However, there is spring ping, but only if you don't lube them. I also do not recommend bag lubing for these switches, or really any of the Akko switches. Do it by hand. The material of the switch is the same as the Matcha greens: polycarbonate top housing, nylon bottom housing, and a palm stem. After lubing these, they sound and feel really good, especially for the price. You can lube the legs and leaf and still have quite a bit of tactility, although I choose not to. Take a listen to the Ocean Blues, lubed and unlubed. Moving to the Lavender Purples. These are very similar to the Akko Ocean Blues with a couple key differences. Number one, same weight, 36 grams. However, the tactile force a little bit heavier at 50 grams. You still have 1.9 millimeters of total travel distance, and the tactility still starts at 0.5 millimeters. Now, compared to the Akko Ocean Blues, I like these just a little bit more. Now, the differences are minimal, but make a difference for sure. Firstly, these are the same price at $10 for a 45 pack. They have that heavier tactile bump, which I like because it's extremely satisfying. They sound very similar to the Akko Ocean Blues, but just a little bit deeper. Now the spring changes, however, from a 15 millimeter progressive to an 18 millimeter spring, which is a longer spring. I think this is a much better choice than the one on the Ocean Blue. Smoothness is the same story here, but being a little scratchy before lubing, obviously, but after lubing, feeling really smooth, especially considering the price. The materials are the same as the Ocean Blues, and just like the Ocean Blues, these come to frickin' life when lubed. So tactile gang, lube your lavenders. Take a listen to the Lavender Purples. Now moving to the Jelly Blues, these get a little bit heavier at 40 grams, and the tactile force gets quite a bit heavier at 60 grams. With 2 millimeters of pre-travel, and where these get really different is that instead of starting the tactility at 0.5 like the others, these actually start at 0.3, which is noticeable. Basically, as soon as you press the switch down, the tactility is starting, although that's not the most unique thing about this switch. Now the Jelly Blues. Firstly, these cost $12 for a 45 pack, so slightly more expensive, but these have a heavier tactile bump, but because of the longer spring and tactility starting sooner, these actually feel lighter out of the jump. Like right as you press the switch down, they're going to feel lighter than the other two tactiles. Now tactility is also interesting here because you not only have that initial tactile bump, but also a tactile bump on the way up. Now this creates a really interesting feel, but also an interesting sound when operating it. The overall switch is kind of more muted than you would expect from a heavy tactile, and is fairly deep, but I kind of like it. Now the spring, like I said, is a longer spring, moving all the way to a 22 millimeter dual stage spring. Now in my experience, the dual stage mitigates kinking in the longer spring and mitigates ping a little bit, which is true compared to the Akko Ocean Blues and the Lavenders, which basically these have almost no ping unlubed. But again, you should still lube them. Now the material is polycarbonate top housing and bottom housing with a palm stem. And talking smoothness, these are insanely smooth stock. Like really, really, really smooth. However, they are a little weird and I definitely want to do a build with them, but they aren't my favorite tactile. Take a listen to the Akko Jelly Blues. Here is the back-to-back sound test, stock of all of them, and then lubed. Take a listen. All right, before we go over my overall favorite switches of all of the Akko switches, you have to know about these interesting facts you really need to know. Firstly, all of the Akko switches have a longer stem, so interference is not an issue on any of these switches with cherry profile keycaps. Don't even comment below that it will still be an issue. It is not. I have tested every single one of these switches. It is not an issue. Interference is not a thing with these. But secondly, these are only 3-pin switches, not 5-pin. And some would say, hey, that's not as much stability. However, I think it's a really good thing that they did this. And in fact, it is a fantastic thing that they only made these 3-pin. And the reason is that Akko switches are one of the few switches that fit into Altemu hot swap sockets, which are basically a lot of budget boards. You can find boards for 25 bucks on Amazon that are hot swappable with Altemu slots. These fit in there a little bit tighter than Altemu's, but they fit in there basically better than every other switch that's not an Altemu. All right, but moving on to my overall favorite switches. These are the top 5 switches for me. The best overall linear, the best overall tactile, the smoothest linear, the best sounding tactile, and the best switch for gaming. Again, if you want to check out any of these switches, you can click right over there in that left corner. You can help support me at no further cost to you. Okay, so the best overall linear, in my opinion, the Akko Jelly Black. These things are amazing. They're incredibly smooth. They're incredibly thocky. If you want that sound, they're fantastic for it. It's hard to go wrong for $12 for a 45 pack. Best overall tactile, the Lavender Purples. The Oceans are smooth, but they're a little bit weird because of the double bump. These, I like the heavier tactility than the Ocean Blues, and they do sound a little bit deeper. So overall, I love these things. They're fantastic. And for only 10 bucks, they are so worth it. Smoothest linear, you already know what it's gonna be, the Jelly Pinks. These things are insanely smooth. You literally don't even need to lube them. The lubing really just helps the sound a little bit of the smoothness, but they're so smooth out of the box. It's kind of nuts. If you want a stock switch that's super smooth and then lube it and make it even smoother, this is where it's at. Now, the best sounding tactile, I gotta give it to the Jelly Blues. They're super smooth. They got an interesting sound to them. They really don't sound like any other tactile that I've used. They also don't feel like a whole lot of other tactiles because they're a little bit weird, right? But yeah, definitely sounds unique and awesome. But the best overall gaming switch, if you're a gamer, the Akko Silver switches. These things are awesome. They have that smaller travel distance, which will be great for gaming. They are not too heavy for gaming as well, which is really nice. And they have that quicker actuation at only 1 millimeter. That's gonna be like a normal silver switch with how fast it actuates, which is really nice. And for gaming, kind of a must for me. Yeah, overall a fantastic gaming switch. Every single one of these switches is awesome, and they're all very unique in their own way, which is what I love. They all fill a gap between them. But if you wanna see some lubed Ocean Blues on a legit keyboard, click this video right here. I actually put them on the Ducky 13 SF that I modded, and they actually sound really good on that board with a lot of dampening. The Akko Ocean Blues sound really good. The Lavenders will probably sound even better. So click this video right here if you want to check it out.